dear Mrs. Chani, dear Mr. Cullen, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. And Ms. Chani, I'm not going to comment on this thing with the Bavarian Embassy, but it's nice to be here in this location. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union for the last 10 years has been in a permanent crisis mode, starting with the euro crisis in 2010, with the near default of Greece, 2015 with the migration crisis starting, 2016, only a year later, the Brexit crisis. And that is probably the main reason why we Europeans, and especially these here in Brussels, have been slow to realize that the world around us is changing fast, that we are moving more and more into a bipolar world dominated by China and the United States. And I think the most important international or global development in the last decades, accelerating in the last couple of years, has been China's stunning rise. And coming back from China about a year ago, I was a bit surprised to see how little attention this got here in Brussels, because this is not only changing our geopolitical environment, our rules-based international order, but it's also a challenge more and more to our economies, to our companies. Just to illustrate a little bit the dimension of this development, the thumb rule is every 10 years, the Chinese economy doubles in size, despite being already the biggest or the second biggest economy in the world, depending on what criteria you use. To give you another figure, in 2007, China drew to a level with Germany as to the size of its economy. Germany was the third biggest economy, now it's the fourth biggest economy. That was in 2007. 2015, when I was ambassador to China, only 8 years later, the Chinese economy was 3 times as big as the German economy. So you see the dynamics. But it's not only about the sheer size of the Chinese economy. I think the real challenge is China is no longer producing T-shirts, sneakers, and all this stuff, but it's moving more and more into the high-tech area and becomes more and more of a real competitor. With Made in China 2025, the aspiration is to become the global #1 leader when it comes to future technologies, like robotics, autonomous driving, nanotechnologies, you name it. But it's all these areas and fields where European and especially German companies have so far been leading. Now, there's always a debate on, can China in the end be successful? Well, maybe a little anecdote. When in 2013 I came to China, I visited quite a few German companies, and they were all very relaxed and were telling me, well, you know, they will never be able to close this technological gap that does exist. 5 years later, it's just when I was about to leave China in 2018, there was an opinion poll by the European Chamber of Commerce. And 60% of those polled were saying that they expect to lose their technological leadership to a Chinese company within the next 3 to 5 years. Now, still many people believe that China is just a copycat and that it's not innovative. Can China do innovation? If you look at the artificial intelligence sector, if you look at digital infrastructure, I think it's very clear that China can be innovative, and that especially on applications, it is well ahead of us now. Well, conventional wisdom holds that autocratic political systems can neither be innovative nor can they be really economically successful. I think China proves that this is not true. In my last year in office in Beijing, I used to visit startups specializing on artificial intelligence. You know, they're quite good at some, like face recognition and all of that, where they have really world-leading technology. The real hub in China, there are several hubs, but the real hub is Shenzhen. which used to be a couple of decades ago a fisherman's village, and now is a city of 14 to 15 million inhabitants. It was interesting to talk to the CEOs, and when I checked a little bit their bios, I mean, it was a little bit like, they were graduates from the very renowned Tsinghua University in Beijing, which is the elite university when it comes to technology and these things. Later, they spent a couple of years at Stanford University, usually, before going to Silicon Valley. And then they returned to China. And I asked them, why did you go back to China? And they said, because things are better here for developing artificial intelligence. I told them, please explain. And they said, well, money, there is an abundance. There's more than actually we need. But second, and that is more important, there's basically no rules, data rules and all of that. I mean, it's just like do it. As long as you don't become political or cross the path of the Communist Party of China, you can do anything. And they were also honest enough to tell us, well, protectionism was also helpful keeping foreign companies out. And that's not the only, but one of the reasons why they were able to develop these giant internet platforms called the BATs, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and also it was an advantage that they have something like 1.4 billion potential users, while we here in the European Union still have a fragmented digital market. And the Chinese, well, it's true, they're much more web smart than our average Europeans, especially Germans, I must admit, including myself. And yes, protectionism also here was somewhat of a help keeping Google and others at bay. But they were also quite successful in developing big champions for digital infrastructure. Everybody knows Huawei. And Huawei puts a lot of money in the R&D and is leading today globally in the 5G technology. Obviously also with some support of the state, which basically is a synonym for the Communist Party of China. And its rivals are technologically leaving behind and also being outcompeted on price. Coming back to the EU. The European Union is in a risk of falling behind in future lead technologies. That is especially artificial intelligence and digitization. That would have, if this continued, would have dramatic consequences for our economic base. That means also our economic sovereignty and thus our ability to remain a relevant actor on the global scene, talking about bipolarity. Unfortunately, the new trend is to use economic and technological leverage to achieve political and strategic goals. Some even speak of a weaponization of trade. Let's take a look at China. While we basically believe that business should be free from political influence, in China it's a bit different. Even private-owned companies, well, how should I say, are not being controlled by the party, but there's influence by the party. Every company needs to have party cells. And you might recall the famous saying of Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress almost 2 years ago, where he said, the party commands the East, the West, the North, and the South. Clearly, this does also mean the economy and business. Well, coming to our American friends, I mean, they're not really seen anymore as the big champions of free trade, but there is clearly more protectionist tendencies these days. And also, they tend to use economic leverage, like instrumentalizing the special role of the US dollar to support US geopolitical goals. Let me just mention Iran, GCPOA, or Russia. And one more reason why the European Union needs to act swiftly. There is now what I think we can call a hegemonical conflict between China and the US, and I'm afraid this is here to stay. This is not going to, be away in a couple of months or a couple of weeks in case that there might be a trade agreement. This is going to continue much longer. The problem for us is that the European Union is somewhat caught in between, which is always a very unpleasant and uncomfortable position to be in. Let me just mention the example of Huawei. The US has been exerting quite some pressure on European countries, on European companies, not to use Huawei technology. And our Chinese friends have been making clear that if we ban Huawei technologies, this will have consequences also for bilateral trade relationship. And as there's more and more of a tendency and a policy in the United States to slow down technology transfer from the West, from the US to China, I think we can all expect that that also, will have an effect on European companies, which might also come under pressure to do just this. Therefore, I think it's absolutely clear that the next Commission must develop an overall strategy to strengthen what we call strategic autonomy. And that means especially safeguarding our economic and technological base. So what are we to do? How can we reduce already existing vulnerabilities and dependence vis-à-vis other foreign powers? How do we secure our industrial and technological base? Several ideas are being discussed here in Brussels and have been discussed for some time. The Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker came up with the idea of strengthening the role of the euro. I think about a year ago he launched this. And the idea is to reduce the dependence on the US dollar. I think there's basically a consensus here in Brussels that that would be helpful. The problem is on how do you do this? There's different ideas, and that we still have to discuss inside the European Union, also inside the Council. There are those who say, well, we got to strengthen the European Monetary Union, we got to deepen the European Monetary Union, and there are others who say, well, it's important that member states adhere to budget rules, keep a check on debts and excessive deficits to increase and strengthen the credibility of the euro, and then the euro will be used by companies. So I guess in the end, probably both have to be done. Let me mention another issue, which is industrial policy. For good reasons, it has been out of fashion for quite some decades. But now I think we will have to review in light of the new challenges I just tried to line out. The question is, do we need to promote again industries, strategic industries, like we did a couple of decades ago with Airbus, which was a big success? Well, now it would be probably more about artificial intelligence and digital infrastructure. There is a US and a Chinese internet platforms. I just said there's American and Chinese search engines, no European. Do we have to do something about it in order not to become too dependent at some stage? And if so, will private companies do it, or do we need does a public side have to do it, which means the European Union? That's a discussion that we are already having. Then there is another one, which also was in the headlines from time to time, the question of, do we need EU champions who can compete with companies like Huawei and others? Do we need to change the rules on merger control? It's a highly, to be honest, a highly divisive discussion in the Council right now. Well, we Germans are not advocating a veto by Council, but we believe it would be smart to give more consideration to the global context. Maybe we'll probably have to strike a new balance. Let me mention state aids. The European Union does compete with heavily subsidized companies from third countries. Also here, we will have to do more to have a level playing field and not to disadvantage European companies. Then, and on these issues, my country does not have a clear position yet. There is this discussion about IPI, this international procurement instrument, which basically says, well, if a third country doesn't allow us, to compete for public procurement tenders, then also we should not allow them to do it. This will be also a highly controversial debate in the European Union, but there is some debate that we will have to intensify. It's already on since the Commission came up with a proposal in 2012. And obviously, FDI screening is another discussion. So far, we have some rules, but basically it's about exchanging information on a European scale. Do we have to tighten in order to protect key technologies or not? It's another discussion that we will have to come up with rather soon. So, EU needs to find answers to these challenges rapidly. So I hope that despite the permanent crisis mode, enough attention and energy will be devoted to this, because it is much more crucial than all of the other issues that are being discussed right now. Time is of the essence. Otherwise, we risk to be left behind with consequences for European economic sovereignty and especially the European Union's capability to remain a relevant global actor. Thank you very much.